Tai Park dragged his tired feet across the polished floor of Orion Spaceport, the sounds of ships coming and going a constant background noise he had long since learned to tune out. His 8-hour maintenance shift had felt particularly long today. A broken oxygen recycler in Terminal 3 had taken 3 hours to fix, and then there was that coolant leak in the restaurant district. All he wanted now was to go home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. Just need to clock out and I'm free, he muttered to himself, glancing at his watch. 5 minutes until his shift officially ended. He typed his employee code into the terminal near the staff exit, watching as the system processed his hours for the day. That's when he heard it, a soft, frustrated clicking sound followed by something heavy hitting the floor. Tai turned to see an unusual sight, even for a busy spaceport that serviced dozens of alien species daily. An elderly Zorathy stood amid a pile of scattered luggage. She was small, perhaps reaching only to Taiwan's chest, with delicate blue skin that had faded to a pale azure with age. 4 thin arms extended from her torso, all of them trembling slightly as she attempted to gather her belongings. Her compound eyes, iridescent and faceted like polished gems, blinked rapidly in what Taiwan recognized as distress. Taiwan hesitated. His shift was ending, and he was exhausted. But the sight of the elderly alien struggling alone tugged at his conscience. With a sigh, he stepped away from the terminal. "May I help you with those?" Taiwan offered, approaching the Zorathy with a polite bow, a gesture he knew most alien diplomats appreciated. The Zorathy turned toward him, her head tilted in an expression of surprise. All 4 of her hands stopped their frantic movements, and she straightened her posture. "Most kind, young human," she replied, her voice surprisingly melodious despite the translation device around her neck converting her native clicks and whistles into human language. "These old limbs aren't what they used to be." Taiwan smiled and began gathering the scattered cases. There were 5 in total, each one ornately decorated with swirling patterns that seemed to shift color when viewed from different angles. They were heavier than they looked, made of some dense material he couldn't identify. "Where are you headed?" he asked, stacking 3 of the larger cases and lifting them with a slight grunt. "The diplomatic shuttle bay," she answered, picking up the 2 smallest cases with her lower arms, while her upper limbs adjusted what looked like an elaborate headdress. "Level 7, Bay 12. Taiwan nodded. That was on the other side of the spaceport, at least a 15-minute walk. So much for getting home quickly, he thought. Still, he couldn't leave the elderly alien to make the journey alone. As they walked through the bustling terminal, the Zorathy chatted amicably about her visit to Earth. She had apparently been attending some sort of cultural conference in New Singapore, where she had given a presentation on Zorathy musical traditions. "The harmonics of your planet's atmosphere create the most fascinating resonances," she explained. "Your composers could explore entirely new tonal patterns if they understood how to utilize them." Taiwan nodded politely, only half listening as he navigated them through the crowded main concourse. He noticed how other travelers gave them a wide berth, not unusual when a Zorathy was present. They were a respected species, known for their advanced technology and ancient culture, but they rarely ventured off their homeworld. Most humans went their entire lives without ever seeing one in person. When they finally reached Bay 12, a small contingent of officials waited near a sleek shuttle. They straightened immediately upon seeing the Zorathy approaching. "Lady Kira," one of them exclaimed, rushing forward. "We were about to send security to locate you." Taiwan almost dropped the cases in shock. He knew enough about galactic politics to recognize that name. Lady Kira wasn't just any Zorathy. She was the High Matriarch, the equivalent of their planetary leader. "No need for concern," Lady Kira responded calmly. "This helpful young human has assisted me." The crowds were somewhat overwhelming for an old one like myself. Taiwan carefully set down the cases as the officials rushed to take them. One of them gave him a suspicious look, but Lady Kira waved her upper arms in a gesture that seemed to dismiss their concerns. Thank you for your assistance, she said, turning to Taiwan. What is your name, young human? Taiwan Park. He replied with another bow, deeper this time now that he understood who he was addressing. I'm just a maintenance worker here at the spaceport. Lady Kira's compound eyes seemed to study him intently. There is no such thing as just anything, Taiwan Park. Kindness is not defined by one's position. Before Taiwan could respond, Lady Kira reached into a small pouch attached to her elaborate belt. She withdrew what appeared to be a delicate bracelet, crafted from a silvery metal that caught the light in unusual ways. Please, accept this small token of my appreciation, she said, extending one of her upper arms toward him. Taiwan hesitated. He knew that accepting gifts from alien dignitaries could sometimes be complicated. There were cultural implications he might not understand. But refusing seemed potentially more offensive, especially with the officials watching closely. It's very beautiful, he said cautiously, but it looks valuable. I was just doing what anyone would do. Lady Kira made a sound that his translator didn't catch, perhaps a laugh or scoff. Not everyone stops to help an old one. Please, it would honor me if you would accept it. Feeling trapped, Taiwan extended his wrist. Lady Kira deftly clasped the bracelet around it. The metal felt unusually warm against his skin, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw the patterns on it shift and glow. A token of familial obligation, his translator device chirped, interpreting words Lady Kira had spoken too softly for him to hear directly. Thank you, Taiwan said, admiring the bracelet. It's an honor. Lady Kira gave a formal gesture with all four of her arms, something like a bow but more complex. The honor is mine, Taiwan Park, until we meet again. With that, she turned and entered the shuttle, her entourage quickly following with her luggage. Taiwan stood watching as the shuttle doors sealed and the engines began to hum. Are you completely out of your mind? A voice hissed behind him. Taiwan turned to find Jae-ho Kim, a fellow maintenance worker who specialized in alien environmental systems. Jae-ho was staring at him with wide, horrified eyes. What? Taiwan asked, confused by his co-worker's reaction. Jae-ho grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the boarding area as the shuttle lifted off. Do you have any idea what just happened? That was Lady Kira, the Zorathi High Matriarch. I know, Taiwan said, gently extracting his arm from Jae-ho's grip. She told me who she was. And she gave you that? Jae-ho pointed at the bracelet with something approaching terror. Taiwan looked down at the silvery band. It seemed to be adjusting to his wrist size, fitting more comfortably by the second. Yes, she said it was a token of appreciation. A token of familial obligation, Jae-ho corrected. That's what your translator said, right? Those were her exact words. Taiwan frowned. Yes, but I'm sure it's just a cultural difference in how they express gratitude. Jae-ho ran his hands through his hair, looking genuinely distressed. No. You don't understand. You've been formally inducted into her household. By Zorathi custom, you're now a potential match for her granddaughter. Taiwan laughed. That's ridiculous. I just helped her with her luggage. It doesn't matter, Jae-ho exclaimed. The Zorathi have extremely rigid social customs that date back thousands of years. When a young unmarried male performs an act of service for a matriarch and is deemed worthy, they can be inducted into the family line as a potential mate for unmarried females in the household. Taiwan stared at his coworker, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he held up his wrist. So you're telling me this isn't just a fancy bracelet? That by accepting it, I somehow got myself engaged to an alien I've never met. Not exactly engaged, Jae-ho said, lowering his voice as a group of travelers walked past. More like, officially in the running. And not just any alien, the granddaughter of the High Matriarch of the entire Zorathi civilization. Taiwan looked back toward the now empty shuttle bay, where moments ago he had been feeling good about helping someone in need. The bracelet gleamed on his wrist, and try as he might, he couldn't find a clasp to remove it. "How do I get out of this?" he asked. Jai-Ho shook his head slowly. "That's the thing. I don't think you can. Not without potentially causing a major diplomatic incident." Taiwan's mind raced. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding or an elaborate prank. Things like this didn't happen to ordinary maintenance workers. "I need to report this to someone," he said finally. "The human embassy must have protocols for this kind of situation." Jai-Ho nodded. "Good idea. They'll know what to do." He paused, then added with a hint of nervous amusement, "Though I have to say, accidentally getting yourself into an arranged marriage with the granddaughter of the most powerful Zorathi in the galaxy might be a new record, even for our strange line of work." As they walked toward the security office to report the incident, Taiwan kept glancing at the bracelet. Under the spaceport lights, he could now see that what he had taken for decorative patterns were actually tiny script, words in the flowing Zorathi language, completely unintelligible to him. Whatever they said, he had a sinking feeling his life had just become far more complicated than a broken oxygen recycler or coolant leak could ever be. Taiwan sat uncomfortably in the plush chair across from Ambassador Hannah's polished desk at the Earth Embassy. The room was designed to project human authority while respecting alien sensibilities. Neutral colors, minimal decorations, and subtle displays of Earth's achievements in space exploration. After reporting the incident at the spaceport, Taiwan had been quickly shuttled here by government officials who seemed simultaneously alarmed and amused by his situation. "This can't be binding," Taiwan protested, holding up his wrist where the silver bracelet from Lady Kira still clung to his skin. Despite his best efforts, he hadn't been able to remove it. "I didn't sign anything. I didn't agree to anything. I just helped an old woman with her bags." Ambassador Hannah sighed deeply. She was a small woman with streaks of gray in her otherwise black hair and eyes that suggested years of diplomatic navigation. She tapped her tablet, bringing up a holographic display of what appeared to be a legal document written in both Zorathi and English. "The Zorathi are our most valuable allies in this sector," she explained patiently. "Their customs date back millennia, and they take them very seriously. What you perceive as a simple act of kindness, they view as a demonstration of character worthy of family inclusion." Taiwan ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "But I'm human. Surely they don't expect humans to understand all their customs." "That's precisely why this is so significant," Ambassador Hannah replied. "Lady Kira is known for her progressive views on interspecies relations. By selecting you, she's making a political statement about Zorathi openness to humans." "So I accidentally got engaged?" Taiwan asked, his voice rising slightly. The ambassador held up a calming hand. "Not quite yet. The bracelet is merely an invitation into the formal process. Think of it as being added to a very exclusive dating pool." "A dating pool I never asked to join." "Indeed." Ambassador Hannah stood and walked to a window overlooking the sprawling diplomatic district. Unfortunately, rejecting this honor outright would be seen as a grave insult, not just to Lady Kira personally, but to the entire Zorathi ruling class. "Surely they must understand that different species have different customs," Taiwan argued. "They do understand that," the ambassador said, turning back to face him. "Which is why there are protocols for declining. But you must travel to Zorathia for the formal introduction first. Refusing to even appear would cause a diplomatic crisis." "A diplomatic crisis? Because of me?" Taiwan laughed nervously. "I fix broken air filters and leaky pipes for a living." Ambassador Hannah smiled thinly. "And now, apparently, you help determine the future of human-Zorathi relations." She returned to her desk and slid a thick, cream-colored envelope toward him. Taiwan picked it up, feeling the unusual texture of the paper, not quite paper, really, but some Zorathi material that felt somewhere between silk and metal. Embossed on its surface were swirling Zorathi script patterns that seemed to shift slightly as he moved it in the light. "What is this?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Your official invitation to Zorethia. Ambassador Hannah confirmed. A diplomatic shuttle has been arranged. You leave tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. Taiwan's jaw dropped. But I have work. I have an apartment. I have a life here. All being taken care of. Ambassador Hannah assured him. Your employer has been notified that you've been selected for a special diplomatic mission. Your position will be held for you. Your apartment will be maintained in your absence, and the government will compensate you generously for your time. Taiwan stared at her in disbelief. How long will I be gone? The initial ceremonies typically last about 2 Earth weeks, she replied, consulting her tablet. Don't worry, we'll brief you on all their customs before you arrive. A cultural attaché named Min will accompany you and provide guidance throughout the process. And then what? Taiwan asked. What happens after these ceremonies? Ambassador Hannah's expression became carefully neutral. After the formal introduction, you'll have the opportunity to respectfully decline the match. There's a specific ritual for doing so that preserves everyone's dignity. So I just go there, meet this granddaughter, go through some ceremony, politely say, no thank you, and come home. Taiwan asked hopefully. Essentially, yes. Ambassador Hannah nodded. Though I should mention that the Zorathi value directness. Their concept of politeness is different from ours. You'll need to provide a legitimate reason for declining that they will respect. How about I'm human and she's Zorathi? Ambassador Hannah winced. Actually, that would be considered highly offensive. The Zorathi view cross-species compatibility as a matter of spiritual harmony, not biological compatibility. Suggesting otherwise would imply their belief system is flawed. Taiwan groaned. What counts as a legitimate reason, then? Career obligations, prior commitments, or personal incompatibility based on personality rather than species would be acceptable, Ambassador Hannah explained. Min will help you craft an appropriate response once you've met the granddaughter. Taiwan sat back in his chair, feeling overwhelmed. 24 hours ago, his biggest worry had been fixing that broken recycler in Terminal 3. Now he was preparing for an interstellar diplomatic mission to politely reject an alien marriage arrangement. What's she like? He asked suddenly. The granddaughter. Ambassador Hannah raised an eyebrow. I don't have much personal information. Her name is Su Bin, and she's considered quite accomplished by Zorathi standards. She holds some position in their science guild. Is that the equivalent of being a scientist? Something like that, though their guild system doesn't precisely map to our professional categories. Ambassador Hannah consulted her tablet again. Her full formal title translates roughly to Seeker of Cross-Species Understanding, which suggests she might be involved in diplomatic or anthropological work. Taiwan nodded, trying to picture this alien woman he was supposedly being considered to marry. He couldn't even visualize what a young female Zorathi might look like, beyond the basic blue skin and 4 arms. You leave tomorrow at 800 from the diplomatic terminal, Ambassador Hannah said, standing to indicate their meeting was concluding. Pack lightly. Appropriate attire will be provided for you. Min will meet you at the spaceport and handle all the logistics. Taiwan stood as well, clutching the invitation. Just be respectful, go through the ceremony, and politely decline the match. That's all I have to do. Ambassador Hannah smiled, but Taiwan couldn't help noticing that her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Back in his small apartment, Taiwan tried to decide what to bring on a journey to meet an alien family that had semi-selected him as a potential husband. The ambassador had said appropriate clothing would be provided, so he focused on personal items. His family photo, his favorite book, his lucky maintenance tool that had never failed him. As he packed these few belongings, his communication device chimed with an incoming message. It was from Jaiho. Heard you're heading to Zorathia tomorrow. Don't worry, I'll cover your shifts. And hey, if you do end up marrying the alien princess, don't forget your old friends when you're living in a crystal palace. Taiwan smiled despite himself. If nothing else, This would make for an interesting story someday. Assuming he navigated the diplomatic minefield successfully and returned to tell it. He looked out his window at the night sky, where the first stars were becoming visible. By this time tomorrow, he would be among them, heading toward a world he never expected to visit, to meet a family he never expected to join. Just a simple diplomatic formality, he repeated to himself, trying to believe it. But something about Ambassador Hannah's nervous expression kept coming back to him, making him wonder if he was being told the whole truth about what awaited him on Zorathia. The diplomatic shuttle hummed softly as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Taiwan pressed his face against the viewport, his breath catching at the sight before him. Zorathia gleamed like a massive sapphire against the blackness of space, swirling with shades of blue he had no names for. "First time seeing it?" asked Min, the cultural attaché assigned to guide him. She was a short woman with practical clothing and an encyclopedic knowledge of Zorathi customs that she had been drilling into Taiwan throughout their 3-day journey. "It's beautiful," Taiwan admitted, unable to look away from the planet. "Wait until you see it up close," Min said with a small smile. "The atmosphere contains trace elements that refract light differently than Earth's. Everything has a subtle blue glow, even at night." As the shuttle began its descent, Taiwan watched the planet's surface come into focus. Vast oceans of deep indigo covered most of the world, with landmasses that appeared in various shades of blue and purple rather than the greens and browns of Earth. Sprawling cities dotted the coastlines, their buildings seeming to grow organically from the landscape rather than imposing upon it. "Lady Kira's estate is in the northern continent," Min explained, pointing to a location on the shuttle's navigation display. "The area is called Virushala in their language. It's one of the oldest settled regions on Zorathia, with family estates dating back thousands of years." Taiwan nodded, trying to remember all the information Min had shared. The complex social hierarchies of Zorathi society, the meanings of different gestures, the taboos he needed to avoid. It was overwhelming. "Remember," Min said, straightening his ceremonial collar one last time as the shuttle entered the final approach. "Speak only when spoken to during the initial greeting. Keep your responses brief and respectful. And for heaven's sake, don't stare at their secondary arms." I know, Taiwan sighed. "We've been over this 100 times. And we'll go over it 100 more if that's what it takes to prevent an interstellar incident," Min replied firmly. The shuttle touched down with barely a tremor on a landing pad that seemed to be made of polished blue stone. As the doors opened, Taiwan was struck by the air, slightly thicker than Earth's, carrying unfamiliar scents that reminded him vaguely of cinnamon and sea salt. A welcoming party waited at the edge of the landing pad. They were all Zorathi, their blue skin varying in shade from pale azure to deep cobalt. Their forearms were adorned with intricate metal bands similar to the bracelet Taiwan still wore, though their decorations were far more elaborate. "Remember to bow from the waist, not the neck," Min whispered as they descended the shuttle ramp. Taiwan followed her instructions, keeping his gaze respectfully lowered as they approached the waiting Zorathi. The one in the center stepped forward, not Lady Kira, but a male Zorathi with dark blue skin and elaborate robes. "I am Ren, house steward to the High Matriarch," he announced, his translator converting his clicks and whistles to smooth English. "Lady Kira welcomes you to Virushala. Please follow me." They were led to a transport vehicle that hovered slightly above the ground. As they traveled, Taiwan couldn't help but stare at the landscape. Buildings of crystal and living material seemed to grow from the hills themselves. Water flowed through channels that wound between structures, creating a harmony between architecture and nature unlike anything he'd seen on Earth. Lady Kira's estate came into view as they crested a hill, and Taiwan's jaw dropped despite his best efforts to maintain composure. The house was more like a small city, sprawling across an azure hillside. Crystal spires reached skyward, catching the light of Zorathia's sun, and the 3 moons visible even in daylight. Gardens terraced down to a lake so blue it almost hurt his eyes to look at directly. "It's been in Lady Kira's family for 27 generations," Min murmured. "The central spire is over 3,000 years old." Taiwan could only nod, suddenly very aware that he was a maintenance worker from Earth's orbital platforms who was about to enter one of the most prestigious households in the galaxy. The next several hours passed in a blur of introductions and orientation. Taiwan was shown to his quarters, a surprisingly comfortable suite designed with human physiology in mind, and given time to rest before the formal dinner that evening. "This is really happening," he said to himself as he examined his reflection in a mirror made of some shimmering material that wasn't quite glass. The formal attire provided for him combined Earth and Zorathi styles. A dark blue suit with subtle patterns that echoed the design on his bracelet. Min arrived to escort him to dinner, explaining the complex seating arrangements and ritual greetings he would need to perform. "Lady Kira will introduce her granddaughter tonight," Min told him as they walked through hallways lined with what appeared to be living crystal. "Remember, this is merely a formal introduction. You won't be expected to make any decisions yet." The dining hall took Taiwan's breath away. The ceiling soared at least 30 meters overhead, open to the evening sky, where Zorathia's 3 moons hung like perfect spheres of different sizes and colors. The table was a single piece of blue crystal, somehow grown rather than carved, and set with dishware that seemed to glow from within. About 20 Zorathi nobles were already seated when Taiwan entered. They turned to study him with their compound eyes, expressions unreadable to his human perception. He followed Min's lead, bowing to each section of the table before taking his assigned seat near, but not too near, to the head of the table. Lady Kira arrived moments later, and the entire room rose in respect. She wore even more elaborate robes than when Taiwan had met her at the spaceport, with glittering crystals woven into the fabric that caught the light with every movement. "Welcome, honored guest," Lady Kira proclaimed once everyone was seated again. Her voice carried easily through the hall despite her age. "We are pleased to host you in our ancient home and share our ways with you." Taiwan bowed his head and responded with the phrase Min had taught him, careful to pronounce each click and whistle as accurately as his human vocal cords allowed. A murmur of approval rippled through the assembled nobles. The dinner progressed through multiple courses of Zorathi cuisine adapted for human consumption. Taiwan focused on remembering which utensil to use when, and trying not to stare too openly at the four-armed eating techniques of his hosts. He was midway through a dish that resembled blue seafood when the room suddenly quieted. Taiwan looked up to see that everyone's attention had shifted to the entrance. He turned and froze. A young Zorathi female had entered the hall. Unlike the others with their elaborate formal wear, she was dressed in simpler attire that reminded Taiwan of a scientist's practical clothing. Her skin was a pale, almost silvery blue, and her compound eyes seemed more expressive than the others he had seen. She carried herself with confidence, but without the regal bearing of the nobles. "My granddaughter, Subin," Lady Kira announced proudly, gesturing for the newcomer to approach. Subin walked directly to Taiwan's place at the table. She performed a formal bow, but as she straightened, she caught his eye with a look that seemed almost apologetic. The dinner continued, but Taiwan found it hard to concentrate with Subin seated across from him. She didn't speak during the meal, following the formal protocols, but he occasionally caught her studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. After dinner came music and ceremonial drinks, and finally, an announcement from Lady Kira that the formal introduction had been completed successfully. Guests began to depart, and Min signaled to Taiwan that they too should leave. As he rose to go, Subin approached him directly. "The night gardens are particularly beautiful under the 3 moons," she said in perfect, unaccented Korean that made Taiwan's jaw drop in surprise. "Perhaps you would like to see them before retiring." Min gave a slight nod, indicating this was acceptable, and stepped away to give them some privacy. Taiwan followed Subin through a series of crystal doors that opened onto a garden unlike any he had seen before. Plants with translucent blue leaves seemed to pulse with soft light, while flowers opened and closed in rhythm with subtle music that seemed to come from the plants themselves. "I study human culture extensively," Subin told him as they walked along a path of smooth stones that glowed softly underfoot. "Your languages, your customs, your art. Earth has always fascinated me." "Your Korean is perfect," Taiwan said, still amazed. "How did you learn it?" "I specialize in xenolinguistics," she replied. "Understanding how different species communicate is crucial to true comprehension between our peoples." They reached a small pavilion overlooking a pond where luminescent creatures swam in intricate patterns. Subin paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "This situation is uncomfortable for us both," she finally said, her compound eyes fixed on the distant moons. "I've been fighting my grandmother's matchmaking attempts for years." Taiwan felt a sudden relief wash over him. "So you're not expecting us to actually, marry?" Subin finished for him, making a sound that his translator identified as laughter. "No, though my grandmother certainly hopes we will. She believes a human-Zorathi union would strengthen relations between our species. Ambassador Hannah told me I could politely decline after the formal introduction," Taiwan said. Subin's secondary arms made a gesture his training identified as concern. "It's not quite that simple. My grandmother is determined. She chose you specifically, which means she saw something in you that she believes complements our bloodline." Taiwan looked at the bracelet on his wrist, its patterns glowing softly in the moonlight. "All because I helped her with her luggage." "That act revealed your character," Subin said simply. "To a Zorathi, especially one of my grandmother's generation, character is everything." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the creatures in the pond below. Taiwan felt strangely at ease despite the bizarre circumstances that had brought him here. "So what do we do now?" he finally asked. Subin turned to face him directly. "That Taiwan Park is what we need to figure out together." The morning after their moonlit garden conversation, Subin invited Taiwan to visit her laboratory. They walked through the winding crystal corridors of the estate, passing Zorathi servants who regarded the human visitor with curious compound eyes. "My grandmother has given you 2 days to rest before the formal courtship rituals begin," Subin explained, as they descended a spiraling staircase carved from a single piece of blue stone. "After that, there will be 7 ceremonial events, culminating in your official acceptance or rejection of the match." Taiwan grimaced. The ambassador made it sound much simpler. Just a quick visit, polite refusal, and back to Earth. "Humans often simplify our ways," Subin said, her upper arms making a gesture that suggested mild amusement. "It helps diplomatic relations to pretend things are less complicated than they truly are." They reached a set of doors that, unlike the ornate entryways elsewhere in the estate, were plain and functional. Subin pressed her palm against a sensor, and the doors slid open to reveal a space that looked more like an Earth research facility than part of an ancient Zorathi noble house. "This is my laboratory," Subin said with obvious pride. "I'm one of the few Zorathi who studies comparative xenoanthropology, the study of different species' cultures, and how they interact." Taiwan looked around in amazement. The large circular room contained workstations filled with artifacts from what appeared to be dozens of different worlds. One section housed what looked like Earth items, books, clothing, electronic devices, and even food packaging. Holographic displays showed data in multiple languages, and complex 3-dimensional models of different alien anatomies rotated slowly in the center of the room. "This is incredible," Taiwan said, genuinely impressed. You didn't expect the granddaughter of a traditional matriarch to be a scientist." Subin finished for him, her translator conveying a tone of gentle teasing. "Something like that," Taiwan admitted. Subin guided him through the laboratory, explaining her research on how different anatomical structures influenced cultural development. Taiwan found himself fascinated, not just by the subject matter, but by Subin's obvious passion for her work. "Your Earth languages are particularly interesting," she said, showing him a neural map of human speech centers compared to Zorathi communication organs. Your brains process symbolic representation differently than ours. We're more pattern-oriented, while humans excel at abstract associations. Is that why you're able to speak Korean so perfectly? Ta-Won asked. Because you understand how our brains process language. Partly, Subin admitted, but mostly it's because I find human languages beautiful. Especially Korean. The flow of sounds has a mathematical elegance that reminds me of ancient Zorathi poetry. As they walked past displays of cultural artifacts from a dozen worlds, Ta-Won couldn't help but notice how comfortable he felt in Subin's company. Despite her alien appearance, there was something deeply familiar about her enthusiastic explanation of her research. It reminded him of how he felt when solving a particularly challenging maintenance problem. There must be a way out that saves face for everyone, Ta-Won said suddenly, stopping beside a display of ceremonial Zorathi bracelets similar to the one he wore. I don't want to insult your family, but I also can't pretend I'm ready to marry someone I just met, even if you weren't from another species entirely. Subin's compound eyes studied him thoughtfully. I've been considering possible solutions since I learned of my grandmother's selection. Her forearms gestured toward a workstation where diagrams of Zorathi social structures were displayed. Our traditions are ancient, but they're not entirely inflexible. They've evolved over thousands of years. What are you thinking? Ta-Won asked. Perhaps, Subin replied, her upper arms making an exploratory gesture. Our traditions do allow for a proving period. What if we proposed a cultural exchange instead? A cultural exchange? Yes, Subin said, growing more animated. Instead of a marriage, we could suggest a formal partnership between your Earth maintenance expertise and my xenoanthropological research. You could stay for a period of study, documenting how human and Zorathi approaches to problem-solving differ. It would satisfy the form of my grandmother's selection without binding either of us to a permanent union. Ta-Won considered the idea. Would she accept that? It seems like she's pretty set on an actual marriage. She values our traditions, Subin acknowledged, but she also understands that our society must adapt to thrive in an interstellar community, and she respects knowledge deeply. So we propose this cultural exchange as an alternative to marriage, Ta-Won said slowly. And I get to go home without causing a diplomatic crisis. Exactly, Subin confirmed, though we should present it to her together. It will show respect for her authority, while demonstrating our compatibility as research partners rather than life mates. Min, who had been hovering anxiously since Ta-Won arrived at the laboratory, approached with concern written clearly on her human features. Are you sure this will work? Lady Kira has a reputation for adherence to tradition. My grandmother may surprise you, Subin said. She selected a human for a reason. That suggests she's open to new approaches. They arranged a meeting with Lady Kira that same afternoon. The matriarch received them in a grand chamber lined with what appeared to be ancestral records, crystal tablets inscribed with glowing Zorathi script that chronicled the family's history. Ta-Won stood nervously beside Subin as she formally presented their proposal, her forearms moving in the precise gestures of high Zorathi ceremonial speech. He noticed how the elderly matriarch's compound eyes narrowed as she listened, her upper arms occasionally twitching in what might have been surprise or disapproval. When Subin finished speaking, Lady Kira remained silent for several long moments. Finally, she rose from her seat, her frail frame somehow imposing despite her small stature. The old ways have value, she finally said, her translator rendering her voice with dignified authority. They have sustained our people through millennia of challenges. But perhaps they can evolve, as all living things must. Ta-Won felt a surge of hope, but Lady Kira wasn't finished. I will agree to this cultural exchange, the matriarch continued, but only if Ta-Won completes the traditional trials of worth. If he is to be recognized as a partner to a member of our house, even in research rather than marriage, he must prove himself worthy by our standards. Taiwan swallowed hard. What kind of trials? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lady Kira's upper arms made a gesture his translator couldn't interpret. 3 challenges that test body, mind, and spirit, as is traditional for any candidate seeking union with our bloodline. Su Bin stepped closer to Taiwan. Nothing impossible, she whispered to him. Just nearly so. The first trial will test your physical endurance, Lady Kira explained. You must retrieve a bloom from the Midnight Garden at the base of the Crystal Falls. The second will test your intellect through the puzzle of 17 dimensions. And the third, she paused, studying Taiwan with her ancient eyes, will test your understanding of our ways in a manner that will be revealed only when you reach it. Min made a small gasping sound from where she stood near the entrance. Clearly, these trials were more significant than they sounded. If I complete these trials, Taiwan asked carefully, you'll accept our proposal for a cultural exchange instead of marriage. I will, Lady Kira confirmed, and I will provide formal documentation to your Earth authorities recognizing your honorable fulfillment of the obligation created when you accepted my token. Taiwan looked at the bracelet on his wrist, then at Su Bin, whose expression was difficult to read but seemed encouraging. If this was his way home without causing an interplanetary incident, he had little choice. I accept the trials, he said with more confidence than he felt. Lady Kira made a gesture that his translator interpreted as formal acknowledgement. The trials begin tomorrow at first light. Su Bin may advise you on preparation, but she cannot assist you during the challenges themselves. After they were dismissed, Min hurried to Taiwan's side as they walked back toward his quarters. Do you have any idea what you've agreed to? She hissed. The trials of worth haven't been attempted by a human in over a century. The last one who tried nearly died during the first challenge. Thanks for the encouragement, Taiwan muttered. Su Bin placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. The trials are designed to be difficult but not impossible. They test the qualities my grandmother values: perseverance, intelligence, and cultural understanding. And you think I can pass them? Taiwan asked. I wouldn't have suggested this path if I didn't, Su Bin replied. You already showed resourcefulness by helping my grandmother at the spaceport. You've demonstrated intelligence and respect since arriving here. The trials will simply formalize what I suspect she already believes, that you would make a worthy partner, whether for marriage or research. Taiwan nodded slowly, trying to believe her confidence wasn't misplaced. So what exactly am I facing tomorrow? What's this Midnight Garden? We should begin your preparation immediately, Su Bin said, her compound eyes brightening with determination. The Midnight Garden grows in the deepest part of the Crystal Falls cavern, where light reaches only during a specific astronomical alignment that happens tomorrow. As they walked toward Taiwan's quarters to begin planning, he realized that his simple act of kindness at the spaceport had led him to something far more complex than he could have imagined. Not just a potential marriage to avoid, but trials to face that would test the very core of who he was. And strangely, despite his fear, he found himself looking forward to the challenge. Taiwan limped his way up the crystal steps of Lady Kira's grand ceremonial hall, each movement sending fresh pain through his exhausted body. His once pristine formal attire now hung in tatters. Burns marked his left arm where the heat vents of the Crystal Falls cavern had caught him by surprise. Scratches covered his face from the razor-sharp crystal formations he'd navigated in darkness. His right hand clutched a small container, protecting its precious contents. The assembled Zorathi nobles watched in silence as he approached Lady Kira's throne. Some wore expressions of surprise, at least as far as Taiwan could interpret their alien features. Others seemed impressed. None had expected the human to return from the third trial. Approach, Taiwan of Earth, Lady Kira commanded, her voice strong despite her age. Taiwan took a deep breath and walked forward, conscious of Su Bin standing to the side of her grandmother's throne. Her compound eyes gleamed with what might have been pride. He knelt as he had been instructed and held up the container. High Matriarch, I present to you the heart of understanding, as required by the third trial. Lady Kira's 4 hands reached out to accept the container. She opened it carefully, and the hall filled with gasps as a soft, pulsing light spilled out. Inside was a crystal unlike any other on Zorathia, one that changed colors as it beat like a living heart, cycling through hues that represented both human and Zorathi spectrums of vision. The legends say only those who truly understand the harmony between different forms of life can find the heart, Lady Kira said, her voice carrying through the hall. Many have searched, but few have succeeded. Taiwan remained kneeling, his body aching from the trials of the past 7 days. The first challenge, retrieving the midnight bloom from the depths of the crystal falls, had tested his physical endurance beyond anything he had experienced before. The second, solving the puzzle of 17 dimensions, had pushed his mind to its breaking point, requiring him to think in ways humans were not naturally equipped to conceive. But it was the third trial that had truly changed him. Sent into the sacred caverns with only cryptic instructions to find what exists between worlds, he had spent 3 days in darkness, following intuition rather than logic until he discovered the crystal chamber where different dimensions seemed to overlap. "Rise, Taiwan of Earth," Lady Kira commanded. "You have completed the trials of worth." He stood shakily, aware of every bruise and burn on his body. The medical team would tend to him soon, but for now, this ceremony took precedence over physical comfort. Lady Kira lifted the crystal for all to see. For 1,000 generations, the trials have tested those who seek union with our bloodline. Today, for the first time, a human has completed them. She paused, her compound eyes studying Taiwan intently. "You have shown remarkable adaptability. Perhaps there is wisdom in considering new paths." She handed the crystal to an attendant, then gestured for Subin to step forward. "My granddaughter proposed that in place of a traditional union, you establish a cultural exchange. Having proven your worth through the trials, I now formally accept this proposal." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles. This was unprecedented, a modification of tradition that had stood unchanging for millennia. Furthermore, Lady Kira continued, "I dedicate the resources of our house to establishing an interspecies cultural exchange program, with Taiwan of Earth and Subin of House Kira as its founding directors." Taiwan felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by unexpected emotion. He had come to Zorathia expecting to fight against an unwanted marriage. Instead, he had found understanding, respect, and a new purpose. Subin stepped forward and, in a formal gesture, placed her upper right hand on Taiwan's shoulder. "We accept this honor, grandmother, and pledge to create bridges of understanding between our peoples." The ceremony concluded with traditional Zorathi music and the formal presentation of a new bracelet to replace the one Taiwan had received at the spaceport. This one, Lady Kira explained, symbolized not familial obligation but interspecies cooperation, the first of its kind. As the medical team finally led Taiwan away to treat his injuries, he caught Subin's eye. She made a small gesture with her lower arms that he had come to recognize as her personal expression of joy. 2 months later, Taiwan stood on the observation platform of the newly constructed Cultural Exchange Center, watching as the first shuttle of human students descended toward Zorathia. The building, a stunning fusion of human and Zorathi architectural principles, gleamed in the morning light of Zorathia's blue sun. "Nervous?" Subin asked, joining him at the railing. She wore formal attire that blended traditional Zorathi patterns with more practical styling, a fashion she had developed to represent her role as a bridge between worlds. "A little," Taiwan admitted. "What if this doesn't work? What if humans and Zorathi can't find enough common ground?" Subin's upper arms made a gesture of disagreement. "You and I found common ground, despite the unusual circumstances of our meeting. Others will too." The past 2 months had been a whirlwind of activity. After recovering from the trials, Taiwan had returned briefly to Earth to formally accept his new diplomatic position and recruit the first group of exchange participants. He had selected a diverse group: engineers, artists, linguists, and scientists, all chosen for their adaptability and open-mindedness. Meanwhile, Subin had worked tirelessly on Zorathia, convincing noble houses to sponsor the program and selecting Zorathi participants to pair with the humans. The support of Lady Kira had been crucial. Her endorsement opened doors that would have remained firmly closed otherwise. "I never expected my life to take this turn," Ta once said, watching as the shuttle touched down on the landing pad below. "All because I helped an elderly woman with her luggage. My grandmother claims she knew what would happen the moment she saw you," Subin replied, her translator conveying a tone of amusement. "She says your aura showed potential for cross-species understanding that she hadn't seen in a human before." "Do you believe that?" Ta One asked, glancing at her. "I believe my grandmother rarely does anything without multiple purposes in mind," Subin said diplomatically. "Though I doubt even she foresaw exactly how things would unfold." They watched together as the shuttle doors opened and the first human exchange students emerged, their expressions ranging from nervous to awestruck as they took in the alien landscape around them. "My grandmother still hopes we'll eventually marry," Subin said suddenly, her compound eyes fixed on the scene below. "She mentions it every time I visit the ancestral estate." Tai One smiled. The thought no longer seemed as alien as it once had. Over the past months of working closely with Subin, he had developed a deep respect for her intelligence and dedication. Her alien appearance had gradually become familiar, even beautiful in its own way. "Maybe someday," he said thoughtfully, "but on our terms, not because I carried some luggage."